telefono.
Scusi.
Sì.
Giulietta, per sbaglio, ha firmato dove dovevo mettere io la firma.
Sì.
La metto
Sì,
nel suo posto.
Allora, ok. No, aspetta, vediamo chi è che c'è, vediamo. Ah, ecco, abbiamo anche un ospite, perfetto. Apriamo tutto. Okay, so good evening. I think we can start with the fourth and last seminar of the Sport International Politics in Europe. Our guest is Leo Goretti. Leo Goretti was also a guest in last year class. It's a colleague. Thank you. It's a colleague. It works at the IIA, the Istituto for Affari Internazionali in Rome. He looks quite in detail. He pays a lot of attention to the impact of sport in international politics, and especially as a study the case of Russia. So in today's lesson we will focus. Last year we focused mainly in Putin as a political leader that focus on sport, something similar to what we did this year with Lorenzo Venuti and Viktor Orban. Today, the topic of Leo lesson will be Russian Troublecast for sports great power status. So, Leo, I'll give you the floor, and thank you very much for being here with us.
Thanks a lot, Nicola. It's always a pleasure to be able to contribute and to collaborate with you, as we have done on several different fronts. Yes, let's start talking about Russia's quest for sports great power status. And as you can see from the title itself, I put sports between brackets because I think, and this directly relates to what Nicola was saying, that given the intimate relations that there is between international relations, international affairs dynamics, and international sport, the one, especially sport, cannot be understood without having a clear kind of view, a clear understanding of what the international scenario is and what the different actors, the different states are looking for and what their goals and aims are. So what we are going to discuss today then is a bit of an overview about how sport evolved from the USSR to today's Russia. The reason why this is important is because this ambition to be a great power also in and through sport, I would say, so in sport, so be a great power in sport, but also use sport to reassert Russia's position as a great power, is something which dates back to the Soviet time. So to properly understand the nexus between these two aspects, it's really important to look at history. And then we will also look at Putin's leadership and sport, so how Putin used sport to legitimate his role, and how this kind of legitimation of his personal role, of his personal figure, was also again related to this assertion of Russia's great power status at the international level. So as you will see, there is a clear relation between kind of underlining that Vladimir Putin has been a healthy, a manly, a powerful leader, and then the status of Russia. And in both kind of cases, the role that sports and kind of fitness play is quite important. And in this, there is also a gender dimension that we will briefly touch upon. So it's not just kind of constructing his leadership, it's constructing a male leadership. And once again, this sort of emphasis on gender on masculinity, something which is reflected in an attempt to also underline a sort of remasculinization of Russia vis-a-vis concerns about its decadence. So again, it's important to see how like the focus on the leader is actually important to understand the message that is sent about the nation, the country, the state at large. And then we're going to see how this kind of relates to kind of sports policy in Russia in two different ways, promoting mass sports, but also kind of trying to attain this status as a great power in international competitions. And obviously this leads to the final question, which will be like the final part of the presentation, and then we can discuss about it, which is how now Russia is dealing with the new scenario where it has been kind of the object of sanctions in international sport, how it has been faring in the last 2.5 years, that when its athletes initially couldn't compete in international competitions, and then now they can as individual neutral athletes, and what the perspectives are, because there have been developments of late which I think can lead us to draw some, I wouldn't say conclusions, but to try to kind of understand a bit better what the pathway could be towards what I think will be a reintegration of Russia in the international sports community. So just to give you an idea of how relevant kind of sport is in the construction of power and leadership in Russia, I want to point your attention to this Levada survey, which was conducted in autumn 2017.
Leo, scusa che interrompo,
Sì.
Stai muovendo le slide perché a noi ci appaiono ferme.
Sì, io le ho mosse.
Ah, allora c'è qualche problema perché sembrano ferme.
Let's try again with the slides then. I will kind of share the whole screen. Perhaps it's easier. Let's do it this way.
Anyway, I've already uploaded the slide on Virtuale now.
Is it better now?
If you are moving them, no.
Yeah, I moved them.
No. Maybe try the old way, enter, exit, and re-enter.
Yeah, let's try to do it this way. Yeah, okay. Okay, let's try again. See whether. So I'm now.
Okay, yeah. Now we can see. Yeah, perfect.
Okay. So as I was saying, in 2017, Levada, which is a fairly reputed kind of, or at least it was a fairly reputed independent research center in Russia, carried out a survey about Vladimir Putin, what kind of asking people, Russian people, what features they particularly liked about Vladimir Putin. And the top kind of answers were about him being a real man, manly, decisive, firm, strong-willed. About 19% of the respondents kind of agreed on that. But then there was another 6%, which is quite interesting, which underlined his physical appearance, that is, the good-looking, doesn't drink, leads a healthy life, and is athletic. Why am I mentioning this? Because this clearly kind of underlines how there is this kind of nexus I was talking about before between sport and physical prowess and power in Russia. So power, and especially Vladimir Putin's power, is also constructed through an emphasis on his kind of athletic qualities, on him being a sporty leader, a healthy leader, and a manly leader, right? So I want to underline this so to make a case for the connection between sport and power that is key to understanding like Russia's sports policies. So the questions that we will discuss are about the role that sport plays in the construction of power in Russia, and especially in Vladimir Putin's one, but also how this connects to the Soviet sports traditions. As we were saying before, there is a tradition in leveraging sport for political purposes in Russia, which dates back to the Soviet times. And it's important to understand this to properly kind of also see what the trajectory of Russian sport is nowadays. Then what are the aims of Putin's sports policy, both domestically and internationally? And then, as I was saying, we will discuss what the implications for the future of international sports amidst the Russian war against Ukraine are, and what the perspectives are for the debate about Russia in sport in the coming months and years. So let's start from Soviet times. So in the very early years after the Soviet Revolution of 1917, for quite a few years, the early Soviet leaders were quite skeptical about kind of reproducing the kind of type of sport which was put forward, which was practiced in the rest of Europe, also in the USSR. They thought that the Soviet Union should try to develop a different type of sport, which would be based mainly on kind of local competitions rather than national ones, and in which like extending the practice to the masses of the Soviet population was key. This latter aspect would become a hallmark of Soviet policies through the decades, so the emphasis on participation, right? The government set out to have as wide as a participation as possible by kind of Russian people in sports. But originally this was mainly kind of aimed at kind of improving the hygiene, the health of the population in a way also to prepare them for war. So there was the idea that kind of through kind of physical education, people could be more fit and more prepared to war, but not much about kind of competing in elite competitions, and not about reproducing the type of sport which was developed in the West, so to speak, or in the rest of Europe better, because it was not yet conceived as the West. And then in the mid-1930s, the things started to change in parallel, obviously, with the changes in the kind of Soviet leadership and kind of the new kind of approach to power of the Stalinist leadership. There was also the idea that actually it was good. This was something which was enshrined in Soviet policies in around 1933, 1934, that it was actually good to kind of try to outperform bourgeois sport using the same means. So now it was no longer the idea that the USSR necessarily wanted to construct a completely different type of sport and physical education. Obviously, it had its own kind of features, its own distinguishing characteristics, but the idea was that it should be able to compete and do better than the sport that was carried out and performed in capitalist countries. So this was something which was decided. Obviously, there were changes also in the way that sport was organized in the USSR. For example, for the first time, a national football tournament was organized in 1936. So again, no longer just local competitions, but kind of nationwide ones. And the idea that this was a field where the government wanted to invest also with the idea of competing, right, with other kind of sporting powers and countries. Obviously, this implied also that the USSR had no longer to be a pariah in international sports, but it had to enter slowly, like the world of international sporting competitions, by joining international federations and eventually the Olympics. Initially, this was done by organizing in the 1930s, especially friendly non-official matches with kind of teams from the rest of Europe. And then after World War II, obviously, when the political landscape had changed, and at that point, the USSR started really trying being a member also of the Olympic arena until in 1952, with the Helsinki Olympics, for the first time, the USSR participated in the Olympic Games. And from that point onwards, like the USSR became a full kind of member of the international sporting and Olympic community. Despite this, still some distinguishing features remained in Soviet sport. Sometimes these were more like rhetoric elements which were underlined by the Soviet leadership. In some cases, there was also some reality behind them. And I want to emphasize this because they are important also to understand today's and Vladimir Putin's kind of sport policy. As I was saying before, one of these issues was like the emphasis, one of these features was the emphasis on mass sports. So on having like the largest number of people possible participating in sport, because this was seen a good way, obviously, to use sport for the benefit of the whole nation or of the whole actually Soviet republics, right? So the more people were practicing sport, the healthier like the population would be, the healthier the nation would be. So this is something key. And related to that, there was an emphasis on spreading physical culture among like citizens. And this idea of spreading physical culture was also developed with the introduction of specific certificates, specific kind of titles that were awarded to people who were practicing sport in a sort of way which was considered positive for the nation, such as the GTO, which were certificates which were awarded to citizens which were deemed like as fit for work and for military service, right? And this is important again because these GTO awards were then awarded again, have been awarded again in Russia since 2013, 2014, on the initiative of President Putin. So this again underlines the continuity in like sports policies between the Soviet times and nowadays. And finally, we have like specific sports, especially Sambo, which was a sort of martial art which was developed with military purposes in the 1920s, 30s in the USSR. It was considered a national discipline. It was built upon judo in many respects, but it became part of like the national pride in sport, of course, of the Soviet Union. And later, originally, it was mainly a properly combat sport. Then a non-combat version was also introduced, and this was a specific sport which was considered part of the like tradition also of the people of the Soviet Union, not just Russia, but also like the central kind of Asia republics, for example. And again, Sambo, as you will see, is something which returns then under the leadership of Putin and in recent years. So what is also important is that based on this kind of new membership in the International Olympic kind of arena, and thanks to the investment that the Soviet leadership undoubtedly did over the years in sport, the USSR was really able to attain some remarkable achievements in the Olympics. James Riordan, which is a very important kind of historian of sports, argued that sport is basically the only medium, the only kind of sector in which communist countries during the Cold War were able to take on and even outperform the economically advanced capitalist nations. And you can see that from the table in the slide where I sum up I draw a comparison between the gold medals obtained by the USSR and those obtained by the US in all the different kind of Cold War games. Obviously, 1980 and 1984, as far as the Summer Olympics are not kind of considered because there was the boycotts of Moscow 1980 on the part of the US, and then of Los Angeles 1984 on the part of the USSR. But as you can see, except for those editions in the Summer Olympics, well, the USSR did better than the US 5 times or out of 8, so in 56, 60, 72, 76, and 88, and outperformed the US basically in all the Winter Olympic Games it took part since 1956. So which really gives you an idea of how much pride and investment was made by the leadership of the USSR to make sure that the country was really kind of using this arena to showcase its results. So obviously the rationale was like doing better in sport, it would also be a proof of how better the overall kind of system is. And this idea has been taken up again by Vladimir Putin. You can see that in the quotes that is in the slide. According to President Putin, winning Olympic medals is also always a national triumph and a great contribution to boosting its authority and importance in the world. So if the difference here is both the USSR leadership and the Russian leadership nowadays, they all kind of use sport as a way to kind of increase their status in the global arena. The difference is the USSR leadership was underlining that this was a proof of the success of the communist system. Okay, so there was the idea of that this would prove how the communist socialist system, however you want to call it, was doing better than the capitalist one. Today, under Putin, it's not about a kind of socioeconomic system, it's about really kind of the status of the nation, how important and powerful a country is in the kind of international arena. So it's about the status of, in terms of being a great power of Russia, okay? So, and as I was saying, this idea that sport is something around which one can build up the perception of strength, the image of strength and power, also resonates with the specific features of Vladimir Putin leadership since 2000. Consistently, there has been an attempt in Russia to underline how Vladimir Putin is a strong leader, okay, an athletic leader, and how this is a symbol of the strength of his political leadership at large. And here the narrative goes as follows. So the idea is that in the 1990s, following the end of the Soviet Union in 1991, Russia entered a period of crisis, of weakness, where the kind of flabby, the flaccid leadership of Boris Yeltsin, who is nowadays kind of portrayed very often as a drunk person, as someone who was not able to control himself, and so on. That was a symbol of the weakness, of the decadence the country had entered in the 1990s. When Putin becomes leader at the end of 1999 and then in 2000, then he restores Russia to his kind of strength. And the fact that he's a strong leader himself, he's an athletic leader that goes out and kind of does horse riding or fishing himself out in the kind of great nature of the far east of Russia, as in the pictures that are in the slides. This kind of epitomizes the newly found status of Russia as a strong country, as a country where there is a leader in control, right? So this is really important. So Russia was considered a great power, and obviously it was a superpower through the USSR in the Cold War era. Then there was decadence of the 1990s, and then kind of since 2000, under Putin, the country is on a path to restore its great power status. This is true, generally speaking, and obviously sport plays a role in this process. It plays a role, first of all, because the leadership of the President Putin himself is built around this idea of strength, and because obviously sport and success in sport at the international level is a metaphor, is a symbol of the great power status of Russia. And to delve a bit more into this narrative, in fact, since 2000, President Putin constantly tried to underline the importance that sport had in his own private life through books and DVDs. There is a very famous book and DVD where President Putin teaches about how one can improve their judo skills, which is called Let's Learn Judo with Vladimir Putin, but even more important than that, in 2000, so when he was still running as a candidate, because he kind of replaced President Yeltsin in 1999, I think on New Year's Eve, if I'm not mistaken, as an acting president. And then he ran into the presidential election in spring 2000. In that kind of electoral campaign, he published a book, which was also published in English as First Person, which was a book interview where he talked about himself. And one of the key stories in the book is that when he was a kid, when he was 11 or something like that, he was a sort of hooligan. He was restless and reckless and kind of couldn't find his own way into life. And then all of a sudden he starts practicing judo. And by practicing judo, he developed those skills of strength, of resolution, of firmness, which are key to his political leadership. So the whole narrative was built around how kind of practicing this specific martial art would be central to his kind of future as a strong leader, as he would have become after the election in 2000, right? And this was really, really something which was underlined again and again in all the narrative about the presidents and his biographies and so on. From the perspective of the kind of policies that then the president was introducing to kind of give prominence, give importance to sport in his tenure as president and prime minister for a brief spell, and then again president of Russia. So what was important, obviously, was then to promote mass sport, as we will see, in continuity with the policies of the Soviet Union, but also to achieve again that level of sporting success which had been one of the distinguishing features of the Soviet Union, of the Soviet times. And he wanted to achieve that at all costs and with all means. And in fact, under his leadership, at least since the late 2000s, it was introduced a statewide program of doping to kind of enhance the performances of Russian athletes at the international level. And in parallel, another symbol of like the success of Russia and how the country was building again for itself this status as a great power in sport was securing the organization of mega events. Obviously, it's not just about winning medals, but also it's about showing how a country can organize events with success in its own territory, because this is clearly a metaphor for like how well organized, how economically successful, obviously, a country is. So as I was saying, the whole kind of narrative that Putin carved out for himself as a leader revolves around this love for sport. First of all, as I was saying, martial arts, and especially judo and sambo, which Putin kind of repeatedly stated that taught him how to be a good politician. In what way? Not just developing physical skills, so reaction, endurance, strength, but also developing moral skills, self-control, anticipation, respect for the opponents. What is interesting here is, like in his biography, Putin kind of underlines how judo, in his view, is a particularly good sport because it's not as brutal as boxing. He talks about having tried to practice boxing, but having come out of it with a broken nose because it's somehow too brutal and there is not this sort of ethos behind it, but also more manly and kind of more demanding than karate, which was popular as well in Russia when he was young, but that somehow Putin in his kind of biography seems to despise because he says it looks like a dance, not like a fight, okay? Obviously, judo is important, but sambo, for the reasons I was saying before, is key. Putin was reportedly a sambo champion in St. Petersburg in the 1970s. It's impossible to see whether this is true or not. But what is important is that sambo has been constantly kind of put again at the center of the Russian sports policies under his leadership for a very specific reason. First of all, it's, as I was saying before, a sport which has its roots in a kind of military education, military preparedness. So there is this aspect, but also because it's a national sport. So it's promoted as a Russian-based sport that is part of the national tradition of the country. And in fact, under Putin's leadership, there has been an attempt to have it recognized as an Olympic sport, which happened in 2021. So this doesn't mean necessarily that Sambo is going to be part of the Olympic Games, but it means basically that it qualifies to be considered as part of the program. Okay, so it's the first step before entering the program, but this depends obviously from edition to edition on what the organizers and the federations decide to do. There are other sports that Putin apparently likes and promotes, and these are all sports which somehow go back to the Russian Soviet sports tradition, for example, hockey, skiing, horse riding, or also fishing, whitewater rafting. Interestingly enough, football has never been one of the kind of most loved sports by President Putin, even though, as you know, Russia organized the 2018 Football World Cup, but still, somehow, from what we can gather, President Putin never considered football as part of this kind of more Russian way, and before that, Soviet way to sport. And because of that, it has not been something, for example, he has shown himself to be particularly keen on practicing or following. As I was saying, there is a clear sort of shift from his leadership to the status of Russia. So the idea is that a leader that is fit, well-trained, obviously can be a good leader for a healthy and vigorous country. And this has been particularly true in Russia since, say, 2007, 2008, and 2014. Why these dates? Well, just to make it a long story short, when Putin became president in 2000, the first priority, and I'm talking here about general international politics, not necessarily sport, but as you will see, the two things go together. In the first few years, the main issue was like trying to stave off the idea that Russia was on a path to decadence, to kind of become a lesser power, to become a country which was no longer able to deal with other countries on an equal status. And in the early years, this happened by trying again to have a say, a role within the international community. So Russia even was part of what was at the time the G8. So it was a country which tried to kind of deal with Western countries on an equal basis, but without confronting them. Then in 2007, when Putin gave his famous speech at the Munich Security Conference, questioning like the monopoly that the United States had on international relations, 2008, when there was the war in Georgia, and then even more so 2014, when there was the annexation of Crimea and the first war in Donbass. In this period, from 2007 to 2014, from kind of trying to be again a member of the international kind of community, the country became more and more confrontational of the kind of US-led order, which had characterized the post-Cold War period. So this period was a period where the country started to contest more and more openly the international kind of order. And since 2014, this contestation has become apparent, and even more so after 2022. So the idea then was really to re-emphasize again, not just that Russia was a part of the international community on an equal basis, but that it was a great power, and it was able, along with other powers, not just Russia, but along with other powers such as, for example, China or the BRICS at large, to, in a way, balance the primacy that the United States had in the previous 15, 20 years. So this is important because, again, in this shift towards contestation, sport also plays a role, and this becomes important and apparent also in the sporting field. In terms of like internal policies that were developed to sustain this quest for a restored kind of great power status, there were obviously, again, policies aimed at spreading mass sports participation. And these had different kind of aims, as you will see in the slide, demographic goals. So through sports, the Russian population would be able to live longer and better lives. This is important because there was a real crisis in terms of life expectancy and kind of birth rates in Russia in the 1990s. So the idea was that through sport, the population practicing sport, the population would be able to be healthier, to live longer, and obviously that also the birth rate would increase again. And this also had educational goals in terms of making sure that kind of Russian children would be taken out of the streets and be able to learn those values and kind of principles that Putin himself, by practicing judo, had learned in his childhood. There are also, and these have become more and more important since 2014, as you can see again. Why 2014? Because as we said before, the international sort of status of Russia was changing. The countries was becoming more and more kind of confrontational at the international level. This translates also into international sport, into the country's sport policies in terms of kind of making again more relevant in physical education the military aspect. So the fact that through physical education, Russian people would not just be healthier, they would be also better prepared to kind of defend their country, to kind of make sure that the security of the country would be enhanced and defended. And as you can see, Putin himself talks about this in 2014. He talks about how the development of mass sports in the country can be a vital military aspect. And in this kind of period also, as I was saying before, these GTO certificates about being prepared for work and for kind of military service are introduced again in the country on the initiative of Vladimir Putin. And finally, obviously, through sport, as I was saying, there is the idea of kind of securing international goals. Security included, as you can see here, Russian sports minister, former sports minister, because he's no longer the sports minister, Oleg Matitsin, in 2022 also said that there is a clear connection between kind of sporting success at the international level and the security of the country. So winning medals in sports competition is also a contribution to the security of Russia. Again, there is this nexus, which is also made explicit in the kind of discourse of the government. What kind of successes then the country has been able to achieve? Well, when Putin kind of became president, Russia really suffered a setback in the Salt Lake City 2002 Olympics, when it was fifth in the medal table. As you have seen before, the Winter Olympics have traditionally been a kind of games where the Soviet Union, for obvious reasons, did really well. So kind of winter sports are seen as a field where kind of Russia really has to demonstrate its prestige. The fact that in 2002 at Salt Lake City, the country performed so badly was seen as a testimony of the fact that there had been this decadence in the 1990s, which had to be reverted. And so in the following year, the country sort of improved again, and this was kind of seen as a testimony of the kind of good work that the government was doing. And the main aim was kind of to top the medal table at the 2014 Winter Olympics, because this would be held in Sochi, so on home turf, and this happened in the end. And when this happened, Putin himself made clear, okay, since we have been able in 2014 to top the medal table, our status is restored. We are again a great power in sport, and obviously with this means we are again a great power, full stop, right? So, and this is a kind of discourse, if you look at the speeches that Putin gave at that Olympics, is made really clear. So it's not something which is up to interpretation, because the president himself kind of makes this kind of parallels between great power in sport, great power, full stop. Obviously, the presidency was also able to secure a number of important events: the 2013 Summer Universiade, the 2019 Winter Universiade as well, the 2014 Olympics, obviously, the FIFA World Cup and so on. And also the fact that Russia was able to host these events was seen as a testimony of the success of the sporting policies of its leadership. Bear in mind that especially the 2014 games in this respect were important because they were seen as a way to make up for the fact that the 1980 games in Moscow had been deserted by Western countries. More than 60 countries boycotted the 1980 games, and because of that, President Putin was really keen to make sure that the 2014 Olympics, even though they were a Winter Olympics, so in a way, like the number of participants was necessarily lower, but that they would be a success in a way, unlike the humiliation in a way that the Soviet Union had suffered in 1980 because of the boycott by Western countries. And the 2014 Olympics are important because obviously the annexation of Crimea was basically happened just after the Olympics, and apparently, according to the memoirs of Putin himself, the decision to kind of go ahead with it was made the day before, the night before, actually, the closing ceremony of the 2014 Winter Olympics. Again, as you can see, there is a clear parallelism between these two dimensions, like sport policy and the quest for great power status in sport, and kind of international politics and this quest for great power status there. From 2014, as I was saying, both in sports and outside sports, the level of confrontation between Russia and the West became even greater. So the whole narrative in terms of sports was that the West was somehow trying to damage again the status and reputation of Russia, especially the fact that Russia was sanctioned repeatedly because of the sport doping scandals which broke out in the aftermath of the 2014 Olympics. This was seen as a sign of hostility, obviously, from the West, not just in sport again, but generally speaking. So since the West was trying to tarnish in a way this kind of resurgence of Russia to great power status, it was doing so also in the field of sports through this kind of allegation of dopings and so on. This is obviously the narrative of the Kremlin. I'm not subscribing to this in any ways, but just to give you an idea of what the narrative was. And the other idea was kind of, and this is also important, what happened is that increasingly the leadership in Russia and Putin himself tried to undermine the idea that there was some kind of connection between human rights and sport, especially in terms of LGBT participation, which the Kremlin started to describe as a moral decay. So the fact that there were transgender athletes participating, especially in women's sport. And obviously, because this was also completely at odds with the whole narrative that had been constructed constantly under President Putin about how sport would construct strong men. So basically, this would, in a way, question the whole heteronormative narrative that the Kremlin had built upon sport as a way to foster a healthy, so to speak, masculinity. So what is happening now? So there was this period of contestation from 2014 to 2022. Obviously, following the war against Ukraine, as you may know, Russia has become a pariah in international sport because it has been basically excluded as a country from most of international competitions. This policy was very firm at the beginning. There was a basically blanket ban on Russian athletes, Russian and Belarusian, to be fair, athletes across most of the international sports federations following a recommendation by the International Olympic Committee. And in spring 2023, this was partly sort of reverted because there were concerns about discrimination based on nationality. So there was the idea of allowing some athletes to compete as individual neutral athletes, provided that they met specific requirements. And this has been the policy also that has been applied in 2024 at the Paris Olympics and Paralympics. this is an interesting case. In terms of the Paris Olympics, just a handful of athletes were able to meet these conditions, and just a very limited number of them participated in the competitions, while a more substantial number of athletes participated in the Paris Paralympics. And those who were able to win medals as individual neutral athletes have been kind of welcomed by President Putin just, I guess, 10 days ago or so. And again, as you can see, also in this instance, despite the sanctions, the success that some athletes, para-athletes in this case, have been able to reap on the ground in Paris has been celebrated. And again, this has been kind of, in a way, instrumentalized for international politics purposes. Having said that, the fact that this participation was so limited led the kind of Russian leadership, not just the head of the Olympic Committee, but also the spokesperson of the Foreign Ministry, Maria Zakharova, to launch herself in very kind of scoffing statements about the International Olympic Committee, which in spring 2024, she attacked, saying that it would be a racist and neo-Nazist organization because of its exclusion of Russia and Russian athletes. In this period, there were plans underway also to try to counter the ban by organizing alternative sports competitions with like-minded countries. So one of the ideas was to kind of improve the status of the BRICS Games, which was a competition which already existed, but the Russian kind of leadership tried to make it, I wouldn't say as an alternative, but still as a kind of arena which would in a way be comparable to the Olympic Games, or also to establish new kind of competitions altogether. Especially the idea was to revive the World Friendship Games, which had been briefly organized in the 1980s at the time of the boycott of the Los Angeles Olympics, as a way to have an alternative circuit compared to the Olympics. So there was a clear contestation in this kind of specific instance of the policy of the IOC, and even the risk to create some kind of fragmentation in the international sports community. And the Paris 2024 Olympics really saw like this very harsh rhetoric spreading through, especially with two different kind of occurrences. The first one was like the Russian leadership were being very, very critical of the opening ceremony of the games, where, as you can remember, there was a scene kind of portraying some kind of grand pagan festivity, which according to some would remind of the Last Supper, and then it was described as a mockery of Christianity by the organizers, or as in the word of the president of the International Boxing Association, Umar Kremliev, which is a close associate of President Putin, as pure sodomy. And then the International Boxing Association itself played a key role in kind of undermining the games. The International Boxing Association is an interesting case because it's an association which sort of was taken over by Russian and especially Gazprom money in the late 2010s. Then it was basically, there were concerns about the way the new presidency was kind of running the organization, and it was first suspended by the IOC, and then eventually basically the organization of the boxing events at Paris 2024 was kind of taken away from the International Boxing Associations, and plans are underway to create a separate federation completely detached from it under like the IOC blessing, with the IOC blessing, which will be the World Boxing. So the International Boxing Association, closely kind of associated with the Russian leadership and excluded from the games, created the whole kind of row about Algerian boxer Imane Khelif sex, claiming that she would not be entitled to take part in the games, being transgender athletes, having XY chromosomes and so on, disclosing also very kind of confidential information from tests that the International Boxing Association would have kind of carried out in 2023, and that President Kremlin somehow made more or less public in an indirect way. So there was this, and the whole idea was obviously to undermine the legitimacy and the success of the Paris Games, from which Russia had been excluded. Bear in mind that those games were not broadcast in Russia, which was something which hadn't happened in decades. So where do we stand now? The Paris 2024 games were an instance of like Russia, after having kind of tried to restore its great power status, as I was saying, suddenly being excluded again from international sport. Where do we move from there? And I think here, to understand the situation, we cannot but look at what is happening in international politics with the election of President Trump, and especially if you heard the news about what has been discussed this night in Europe with President Zelensky, it looks quite likely that there will be plans underway to at least get to a truce between Ukraine and Russia early next year, because the US presidency is going to make a huge pressure on Ukraine for this to happen. And Putin himself hasn't ruled out this option, which means that the scenario would change quite quickly. If the scenario changes quickly, this is going to have an impact directly also in the sporting field. And there have been hints that there may be something happening again. For example, I think 6 days ago, the head of the Olympic Committee in Russia has changed. And the new head of the Olympic Committee, who was a former governor in Eastern Russia, is someone who has been subject to sanctions in the West because he's been actively involved in organizing the war. But at the same time, when he took over the presidency of the Olympic Committee, he said, we need to stop being aggressive towards the international sport institutions because we want to reintegrate into that. And so at the same time, the plans to organize the World Friendship Games have been suspended. These are hints, I think, that the Russian leadership is trying to create again some kind of dialogue with international sport institutions with a view to reintegrating into sport as quickly as possible, as soon as obviously the international scenario makes it possible. This also impacts, I guess, on the whole kind of process of selection of the new IOC president. There are 7 candidates who are running for the position of Thomas Bach. 2 of them have a profile which is clearly carved also in terms of the Russia question. Sebastian Coe, the president of World Athletics, has been very vocal in that he doesn't want a quick reintegration of Russia because of concerns about the violation of international law, but also because of its kind of state-sponsored doping policy in the past. And on the other hand, instead, the other kind of perhaps the front runner, which is like Jose Antonio Samaranch Jr., who is the son of the former IOC president, he has made clear that one of the main kind of topics on his platform for the election is to reintegrate Russia into the sporting world. Now, my feeling is that with the election of President Trump in the US and the possibility of some kind of approach or anyways kind of truce in sight between Russia and Ukraine, this could even have some kind of impact on the whole IOC presidency issue, possibly favoring Samaranch over someone like Coe, who has had this sort of more anti-Russian position, which could become a problem if the international scenario changes and makes it possible for a Russian reintegration into international sport. Because as you can imagine, obviously, the IOC will only have an interest in kind of healing the rift with Russia, despite the harsh rhetoric of last summer, as soon as possible once the international scenario allows to do so. I'm going to stop here, and I'm really happy to take any questions from you or from Nicola, or as you see fit.
Thank you very much, Leo, because we somehow with this lesson today, you have given as a sort of long-term perspective. It doesn't start everything in February 2022.
2022, yeah.
Yeah, with the invasion on Ukraine, but the political investments of Russia in international sport exist in a long scenario. And in somehow allowed me this parenthesis. We discuss about the use of the word sports washing and why it's not adapt from an academic perspective, and in somehow we can see Russia is doing a political investments in international sport different as history and approach, but in concrete is not so different from the one that the Saudis are doing or the US is doing, and no one speaks about the Russian investments in international sport as sports washing. And so again, we can see that there is a different type of vision and moral judgment in somehow when we use this word that, as I said, it's acceptable if you are an activist or if you are in this type of context, but not at academic level, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, can I say something on it? Because I
sure.
totally agree with you, Nicola, and I think the Russian case really highlights how this kind of investment, and I try to underline because this also relates to I don't know, the Saudi or the Qatari or the Emirati investment in sport. You have two different kind of ways to do so. One is organizing events, the other is achieving success. But in both cases, the idea is to showcase the strength, the power, the capabilities of a country. So the idea that this is just done to somehow cover under the carpet some kind of abuses or violations is totally naive, because the idea is exactly the opposite. These strategies are aimed at improving overall the status and kind of influence of a country. Obviously, this is not going to change the equilibria in international politics per se, but the idea is not that you are trying to wash any kind of image that you have. It's exactly the opposite. You want to improve in a positive way your image and perception, and you are trying to do so not just targeting the Western media, like, I don't know, The Guardian, who can talk about sports washing. You are targeting a global audience. You are targeting people in Africa, in Latin America, in South Asia, who are not necessarily that kind of interested in the kind of narrative that a liberal Western newspaper can kind of put forward, but that are surely interested in following what a country can achieve in terms of organizational capabilities and creating a mega event. So I think it's totally misleading. And the example of Russia, which, as you said, no one really talked about sports washing in Russia, and this is interesting per se, but it's a good example of actually how how kind of sporting kind of power is used to create more general kind of soft power or influence, or however you want to call it, in the international arena. It's not just kind of trying to silence criticism. This doesn't make much sense to me.
Exactly. So let's open the debate. Do you have any specific question to Goretti? Some comments regarding today's presentation? Yes. Wait, Leo, tell me if you can listen. Bye.
I wanted to ask how Russia will be able to preserve using sport as a soft power would be excluded by some of the most important international competitions.
Have you heard or I have to repeat? Okay, perfect.
No, I think this is exactly the reason why it's important for Russia to be reintegrated into international sport as quickly as possible. Because the main way to achieve, I mean, let's go back to what I was saying at the beginning about Russia in Soviet times, in early Soviet times. You try to kind of have your own kind of sporting system outside the rest of the world. That's not going to be particularly useful in terms of like either kind of domestic influence or, most importantly, international influence. What changed the whole kind of discourse about sport in Russia was the decision in the 1930s to try to integrate into the international system. And this whole success story, because it's such, however you want to kind of judge it, of Soviet sport, through doping, in a dictatorship or whatever you want, but in terms of results, it was a success story. This was possible just because the Soviet Union became part of the Olympic movement 100%. And as I was saying, the fact that the Moscow 1980 Olympics were boycotted was perceived as a huge harm to the national pride. So this is just to say that if Russia just tries to build its own games with like-minded countries, I don't know, China, perhaps India, perhaps some Central Asian countries, well, that's not going to be particularly helpful in terms of its prestige. Perhaps it can partly help in some countries of the post-Soviet space, but generally speaking, it's not going to make a huge difference. The only way that Russia has to kind of preserve this kind of position as a sports great power is to be part of the international competitions. And this is, I think, also the reason why, as I was saying, there is already evidence that they are trying to move ahead from the plans to create their own games, to try to reintegrate as quickly as possible into the international kind of sporting community. This can only happen, as I was saying, if the situation with regard to the war changes in the next few months. But, and here I'm talking not just as someone who is interested in sport, but as someone who works in a think tank which deals with international politics, it's quite likely that this may happen. So I think that next spring it may happen that the situation in the war changes with some kind of truce, some kind of ceasefire, some kind of, I don't think a proper peace, but some kind of ceasefire might happen. And at that stage, I think I wouldn't be surprised if sport would be one of the first kind of areas where Russia reintegrates into the international community, and where the kind of sport leaders are going to say, oh, let's see how we are going to be able to have Russian athletes compete along with Ukrainian athletes. And sport is a fantastic kind of turf to create kind of these interactions and all this kind of rhetoric on which they are so good at. So I think that it's to get to your point, yes, Russia has to reintegrate as quickly as possible. Should this situation kind of last for 10 years, I don't think that this will happen, but shouldn't Russia be left out of international sports in a comprehensive ways for 10 years, that would be a huge problem. Also because obviously being outside the system would mean that you are not able to catch up with progresses in training, in techniques, and so on. And so that could be a problem. But I don't think that will happen. And I think that they will try to be a full member again in the community as quickly as possible, despite all that was said about the Paris Olympics and all these rows and kind of criticism and so on.
And somehow we have also seen how costly is, like economically costly for Russia is to be excluded from international sport, because in order to organize some friendly match, they had to usually pay some minor sports federation in order to organize some unofficial friendly matches. We know that the Serbian Football Federation, that was a quite powerful football federation, obtained a significant amount of money from the Russian Football Federation in order to play a friendly match. So it was, of course, a political move, but also it was an economical move and quite costly. That, generally speaking, when you play a friendly match, you share revenue, and in this case for Russia, in order to maintain a sort of presence in international sport despite the exclusion, it's quite expensive in somehow. Other questions?
Okay, can I add something on this? Because it's quite. Let's go back again. Let's go back again to the case of Saudi Arabia. Okay, that's a good example of how difficult it is to legitimize new competitions. So it is one thing to be able to invest in events and secure events, which are part of the existing international sporting kind of calendar. And this is something which you can kind of leverage for your kind of power purposes. But to take a competition which is a third-rank competition like the Saudi Football League, and to try to make it a prominent competition, even pumping a huge amount of money, buying superstars and so on, that's much more difficult. I think that experiment has basically already failed. And it's a good example of how difficult it is to create a new network of events and how costly it is, as you are saying. So clearly, that would be really difficult to do for Russia. And let's think about some kind of games where like Western countries are not part of, and perhaps just kind of other countries from the rest of the world. In terms of being able to make them appealing at the global level, that would be extremely, extremely difficult, I think.
Other questions? Yes?
After the end of the war, how long it will take for Russia to return to the international arena? And if we look back to the history, we can see like after the Second World War, it takes 8 years for Germany to come back to be allowed to participate in Olympic Games. Even if it's possible after the end of the war, or it's possible after the end of the Putin regime.
No, I think it's possible after the end of the war, because the main problem with that comparison is that Germany lost the war. And what we are seeing now, I don't think that Russia is going to lose the war. It's not going to win the war completely, so it's not going to kind of, hopefully, it's not going to take over Kiev, but the final truth will be such. And what President Zelensky said yesterday is quite telling. He basically renounced Crimea. He renounced the Donbass. That's a huge defeat compared with the premises of the war. So in the end, the war is going to end in a way which is going to be, unfortunately, from my point of view, is going to be quite favorable to Russia. So the difference is Germany lost the war and was then a pariah in the international community. Here, there is going to be some kind of settlement where Russia is not necessarily going to look like the loser. And also in terms of, and part of the settlement will surely be that sanctions have to be, I mean, I'm not going to say lifted, but for sure, sanctions are going to be part of that discussion. And to be frank, sporting sanctions are the easiest to be lifted. They are not costly for everyone. So if there is some kind of terrain, as I was saying, where you can create an idea of goodwill that you are able to re-engage with Russia, sport may be perhaps one of the easiest one to do so. So my feeling is that it could take not so much, a few months. I think it would be quite quick after that. Obviously, should kind of Russia lose the war without regime change, I think that would take a long time then. But I'm afraid I don't think that this is what is happening.
And then also I give you immediately the floor. And then also we have not forget that there is different balance of power in every international sports federation, and so in some international sports federation the potential re-enter of Russia will be quicker than other. Yes, Francesca.
Yeah, I can't hear Francesca, so if she can come closer to the.
Ecco, vai, che avevo silenziato per sbaglio.
Can you share from here?
Yes.
Yeah, so we've seen how ever since the 2000s, Putin has emphasized how vital a sport has been in his life and for his development as a good politician. And we've seen how the Russian government has been trying to advance this narrative that a fit body equals a strong leadership. And so that a president that is fit, is physically fit, can foster the general health of the whole country. And I wanted to ask you, do you think that this narrative has a degree of truth, or do you think it is completely unrealistic?
Well, I think generally speaking, the nexus between the leader and the health of the country doesn't make much sense. Sure, like obviously if you have, and we have seen the other side of the coin with President Biden. Like if you have a leader who really looks like aging or frail or personally like not that fit, that kind of creates a sense of concern about where the country is going, even though this may not necessarily have anything to do with like where the population is going. But in terms of perception, I think that having a leader who is ailing, so a leader who is aging, a leader who looks like ill, a leader who looks like no longer able to be fit for purpose. In fact, we say fit for purpose, fit for the position. That's not going to be good. And then in terms of like the policies, obviously there is to an extent the idea that if a leader is particularly interested in sports or in physical education, it may well be that they have a bit more of kind of the tendency to invest in that. That I think would also be quite natural, but then that this kind of investment is necessarily conducive to good results per se, I'm not sure about it. It really depends on where the country as a whole is going, and that has not much to do with how many hours a day a president is kind of spending, conditioning, or exercising, because this is also part of this narrative. Like there have been also leaks about the fact that Putin kind of exercises 2 hours and a half a day, or this kind of stuff. I don't think that this has any kind of impact per se on how kind of fit or well prepared or healthy the population of a country is, even though obviously someone who is really personally interested in sport may have a propensity to kind of monitor more this kind of area of policy than other leaders. But for sure, as I was saying, if a country has a leader who looks really kind of no longer fit for purpose, yeah, that's not good. And if you remember the early days of the war, there was a lot of talk about Putin himself being ill, being unwell, and so on. And there are statements, and I'm not sure whether they are in the slides, but there are in a paper that I wrote on this, and you can easily find them online. Putin was quite quick in saying, no, that's totally not true, and I'm proving this because I'm still doing a lot of sport. So as you can see, again, this has been used to dispel the idea that actually the leadership was weak and frail.
Yeah.
And then I also wanted to ask you, I've recently watched the Swimming World Championships in Budapest, and I've noticed that the Russian athletes that were competing under the label of Neutral Athletes B. And I'm just curious to know why B, like what does that stand for?
And to be honest, I have no idea. We need to look into that. I have no idea about that. But you know, something which is interesting is like the regulations about neutral athletes. This is in a way related. After Russia was kind of under kind of the spotlight because of the doping scandal. So in the different Olympics, it has always kind of competed basically not as Russia, but under different kind of banners, like either the Russian athletes or the Russian Olympic Committee and so on. And one of the concerns was that in all these different kind of instances, still they were using basically national colors. They were able in a way actually to compete. They didn't use the name Russia, but in fact they were actually representing Russia 100% in a very visible way. So what was decided in Paris, it was like the regulations should be such that individual neutral athletes should not be able in any way to create this connection with their country of origin. So not bearing kind of, I don't know, a sort of kind of sporting suit where you could have the colors of the country and so on to prevent this. So there were clear regulations. So I'm quite sure that what you are saying, there must be some kind of specific reason why this kind of this B was introduced there, because it's quite relevant actually.
Other question? Then last Tuesday I showed the students a tweet in which the Ukrainian condemned the fact that Putin was honoring the Paralympic neutral Olympic athletes now, and so it's also interesting in this sense. If there are no other question, I have one question for you that is impossible to answer, but I want to know your idea, your opinion, because of course we cannot foresee the future. But do you think that Russia, when we will re-enter international sport, she will continue to stay in the European Confederation, or she maybe move to the Asian one, or in some federation took one direction, in some other international federation the other path?
Yeah, I think the last option that you mentioned is the most likely, I think, because as you were saying, it really depends on how the kind of power balance in each federation is. So I guess, generally speaking, in my view, there were talks about Russia moving to Asia during the last 2.5 years. I think that this could happen in some specific federations, but generally speaking, it would be more beneficial, I think, to for the reasons we were mentioning before, to stay in the Western kind of in the Western federations. So I think that could happen in some sports, but I don't think it's going to happen all across the board. But as you are saying, we really need to see what happens. My feeling is, I don't know if there is a sport where the European Federation is, I don't know, under sort of Latvian or Estonian president or Polish president, that could be more uncomfortable for Russia to be there for a while. Otherwise, I think they are going to stay there where they were before the war.
And then, if you remember what we have said about the election of Usmanov, if we have to bet in which federation, excluding of course the IBA, that is a half federation now, but which recognize international federation, the Russian potentially will make they re-enter first, I will definitely bet for the fencing federation, because Usmanov, as we said, he had to step down because of the sanction, but has been re-elected as the president of the International Fencing Federation. So probably it's a federation that we should keep an eye on, because things could move in a different direction.
Okay. Can I just add something on the boxing one? Because again, and this is another sign that's there is the idea of reapproaching like the IOC quite quickly, because there has been the Congress recently of both the World Boxing and the IBA. And in the IBA one, it has been made a change to the statute that says that under specific conditions, they will allow athletes to be part of two different kind of organizations. And the idea why they did this is exactly because they don't want to lose athletes with a view to 2028. So I think that this is also telling, like they are not trying to detach themselves further, but they are trying somehow to keep the channels open, even in the most extreme federation, because I think they are really kind of eyeing a re-entrance into the kind of Olympic movement. Even that would be really difficult with the IBA, but still the IBA nowadays has more national federations than the World Boxing.
Yes,
so it's 120 versus 65. So let's see what happens.
It seems another war, even though at least without people dying, but another war that cannot be won by any one of the two contenders, but even can not be lost by losing.
And so in the end you will have to find a compromise, and so it's better to keep these channels open rather than creating two different networks, none of which is really maximizing the potential that the boxing sport would offer. I think that's the idea with this kind of provision, that athletes can be basically competing in both. So because this is what
absolutely. Do you have any other question? Any final questions? Leo, do you want to add some other consideration on the future of international sport? How do you see? We discussed a little bit last Tuesday about the future scenario, the biggest challenge that international sport is going to face. Of course, we discussed as well about the IOC race that you mentioned in your presentation. I don't know if you have any final conclusion.
No, I think what is going to be interesting, there are a number of issues which are going to be interesting. Well, World Cup and Olympics under President Trump, it's going to be interesting because we are going to see both, and especially the 2028 Olympics are going to take place in the US amidst a presidential campaign. So that's going to be quite remarkable, I think. And bear in mind that this whole Imane Khalifou, I didn't mention that in my presentation, but one of the last kind of ads that President Trump published via X before the election on the 3rd of November, so just the day before. So Imane Khalifou was unwittingly one of the main protagonists, because he was saying again that he will not allow men to take part in female sporting events. So I think that's going to be quite interesting to monitor, and then see what happens also with the World Cup 2034 with Saudi Arabia, which has been awarded. But that may be, I think, something to talk about in the next 10 years, basically, because it's going to be a long journey to it. But yeah, it's going to be interesting to monitor.
Okay, Leo, allora, thank you very much. It was very interesting.